If it wasn't clear from my first 6 videos yet, I'm a total Roma-boo. I want to clarify the ironic controversy surrounding my last video, which was also my first major success on this channel, so to speak. By the way, thank you very much for the support. My main intention with my alternative history content creations is entertainment. I'm not an expert historian in the microscopic sense, and to be fair, no one on YouTube who makes that kind of content is. That I can assure you. Because if any of you were still holding out the hope of finding a realistic alternate scenario on the internet, I have some sad news to tell you. You've been living a lie all this time. Because certainly we can all disagree with certain opinions or observations we have about history on a personal level. To claim that some facts are more objective than others would be pretentious and arrogant on anyone's part. But still, there is something, just one thing that I can affirm without the slightest fear of being wrong, and that is an objective fact. And that thing is that realistic alternate scenarios can exist because we haven't invented multiversal travel yet. The day a person can, with proven and demonstrated ability, travel between the multiverse if it exists, and see how certain changes in our history led to different conclusions than those we had experienced in our own history, then yes, there will be creators of alternate history content who are more legitimate and objective than others. Until that day happens, all those alternate story content creators you see on the internet and YouTube are just creating fiction. We're creating fictional content with historical themes for people's simple entertainment, and indirectly for some, like me, to get them interested in researching the true history after seeing my content. So, for those of you who were starting to act pedantic in my previous video putting on your suits and glasses of qualified academic university professors, to feel superior to me in order to destroy something that was never intended to be anything more than pure fiction and entertainment. Just relax, chill, have some weenum, eat some panis with garum, and enjoy entertaining and believable fictional stories that can stop for a moment your suspension of disbelief, but without ever, absolutely ever, pretending to be realistic. Because remember, until multiverse travel is invented, all of this will remain highly theoretical and fictional, and no matter how much expertise you have in human history, it will never cease to be purely entertaining with no possibility of being truly objective. Now that this has been said, let's make Carthage win the Punic Wars against Rome, shall we? Now, as I said at the beginning of the video, I'm a total Roma-boo. But, even I, an absolute follower of the ideals of the greatest civilization that humanity has ever seen, has to occasionally show some fairness in not always making Rome victorious in my alternate scenarios, and from time to time give the spotlight to other important actors in our history. But still, Rome is the most important thing in the history of humanity. The others are just secondary characters, let's all be clear about that. But certainly, I have always felt that there was a certain missing actor during the main part of what we call antiquity. I have always felt as if between Rome and Persia, a third actor was missing to complete the balance of civilizational equilibrium and the rivalries that marked that era. And that third actor was, of course, Carthage. So what if they managed to survive longer? What if Carthage had won the Punic Wars? That's the alternate history scenario we are going to see today. First of all, we all know the general history and rivalry between Carthage and Rome, which eventually led to the fall of that exploratory and commercial empire. We know the miserable, if not almost zero chance they had of winning those wars. Simply put, we are talking about two completely opposite civilizations, with very different ideals, governments, and mentalities that led them to adopt very different behaviors or decisions in the same context. Rome was young, defiant, with a warlike and combative attitude, with a thirst for conquest accompanied by a genius mindset and adaptability that the stagnant and bureaucratic Carthage simply could not compete with. Carthage simply did not have, and would not have even with the best will in the world, any chance of beating Rome no matter what. At least defeat Rome alone. You see, I think there is a chance, a very small one, a minuscule one, but a chance nonetheless that Carthage could have emerged victorious from the Punic Wars. And that microscopically small opportunity would be to have a better coordination and alliances with the Greeks. Carthage could only defeat Rome if they and the Greeks joined forces in perfect synchronicity to defeat their young rival, which Rome was becoming. At that time, the different Greek kingdoms or city-states were beginning to become aware of the rise in power and danger of the young Roman Republic, and of its not-so-disguised intentions to, at some point, dominate the Hellenic culture by considering themselves the continuation or heirs of the Greeks on a symbolic level. And the Greeks would begin to understand this, especially after Pyrrhus of Epirus' humiliating withdrawal from Italy after having tried to protect the Greek colonies in southern Italy from the expansionist Roman Republic. The problem with Pyrrhus is that shortly after his humiliating retreat from Italy, he died in the city of Argos in 272 BCE. His death was purely a product of bad luck during a fight in the streets of Argos between its inhabitants, and would have been easily preventable if he had not been in that place at the same time as in our timeline. Had Pyrrhus lived longer, he would have been able to reorganize and use his military experience in Italy against the Romans to create a sense of hatred, resentment, and terror toward these powerful enemies. The Greeks generally distrusted the Romans and were quite suspicious and resentful of them, but Pyrrhus's exaggerated propaganda stories might have convinced the Greeks to create a functional union between their different kingdoms and city-states in an attempt to defeat or repel the Romans, with the possibility of one day dominating and conquering their Hellenistic lands. And with the Romans attempting to take control of the island of Sicily, and thus starting the First Punic War, the Greek coalition against the Romans would find in that situation a golden opportunity to offer their help and alliance to the Carthaginians against the Romans. Assuming the alliance between the Carthaginians and the Greek coalition against the Romans was successfully implemented, both groups could organize efficiently to surpass Rome's current capabilities. The Romans of that time were warriors dedicated to victory no matter the cost in lives, able to repopulate their population non-stop for decades while literally millions died, so they would never fall to simple defeats in the classic sense of the word. They would literally not stop spamming their men until the last Roman had fallen. That's how determined and ferocious they were in that era, being the main reason why they were so feared and why they defeated Carthage in our timeline. For this reason, I think that although a perfectly coordinated alliance between Greeks and Carthaginians would have been a catastrophic defeat for Rome due to their mentality and determination to fight to the bitter end, the Greco-Carthaginian coalitions could not have completely eradicated Rome after the First Punic War, but they would certainly have inflicted a tremendous defeat on it. For example, after the victory of the Greeks and Carthaginians, both would divide the territories they wanted to obtain or recover. Southern Italy would be fully under Hellenic control once again. Sicily would once again be under Carthaginian control, except for the east coast, which would be under Greek control, with the city of Syracuse being the most powerful and influential in the area. Also, the Greeks and Carthaginians could free the Etruscans from Roman control and transform them into a client state loyal to them in order to keep a close eye on the Romans in the Italian peninsula. Carthage would take advantage of the situation to reassert its control over the islands of Corsica and Sardinia as well, and to optimize its trade system around the Mediterranean, they would annex all the northern coasts of Hispania and southern Gaul to connect it with the northern coast of Italy alongside the Etruscans as a satellite state, with the Greeks accepting Carthaginian control over Massalia. After all these agreements and territorial reorganization, Rome would find itself greatly diminished in territory, power, prestige, and morale, only maintaining its territories in central Italy after that alternate First Punic War. Eventually, time would pass, and the Romans, feeling bitter about that humiliating defeat that abruptly stopped the momentum of their unbridled expansion, of course would not give up and just move on, accepting to return to being a simple dot on the Italian peninsula. As I said, the Rome of that time was determined to fight to the last man standing. No matter the cost, they would just keep on fighting. But this time, it wouldn't be so easy. Rome lost a large part of its territory's military power and was short of money to form new armies due to the enormous monetary compensation it had to give to the Greeks and Carthaginians in the previous Punic War. Even if the Greeks are not present in the second round of the Punic Wars, in this timeline Carthage would prosper, being larger, more powerful, richer than ever, and now with some military experience due to the previous war, although the military was still not its main focus as a civilization. I have no doubt that Rome would be the one to initiate hostilities for this second alternate Punic War, executing several innovative and exceptional military strategies for the time, proper of the legendary adaptability and genius of the Romans while waging wars, as we all know. However, no matter how adaptable, creative, violent, and bloodthirsty the Romans are, in this timeline they simply wouldn't have the advantage at all, no matter how hard they tried. And since the First Punic War, the Roman Republic has surely progressively lost power and influence over the multiple Italian city-states, especially with the annoyance that the Etruscans would once again be as neighbors, now supported by the Carthaginians. and it would be very likely that, traumatized by the First Punic War, the Italic peoples under Roman control, seeing how the Romans wanted to send them to war with Carthage again, would begin to rebel and demand more concessions, lands, and tax exemptions to remain loyal to Rome. Something that the city, immersed in its war effort against the Carthaginians, could not allow, meaning that in addition to waging war on the other side of the Mediterranean with the Carthaginians, it would also have to fight several civil wars to pacify the peoples who would rebel against Roman control. Combined with the annoyance and assistance of the Etruscans allied to Carthage, it would simply be too much for Rome, ending up once again losing the war, this time in a more devastated state than the last time, with the person responsible for their most important defeats in that conflict likely being a certain general named Hannibal. Rome would be brutally reduced in territory, losing practically all the influence it previously had in the Italian peninsula, remaining only with a territory composed of the Latins around its city. The rest of the peninsula would be liberated from Roman control, some becoming independent city-states again, others under Greek influence, and others under Etruscan influence, which would be the same as saying under Carthaginian influence. By that point, Rome would be a mere shadow of what it once was, no longer possessing much of what had previously made it a great power, returning to being little more than the miserable city-state it had been after its founding centuries earlier. But, again, Rome at that time would have preferred to die in combat than simply live with the humiliation of having been reduced to so little by its enemies, and regardless of the fact that the war was already lost from the start, they would continue trying until the last moment. In a last desperate effort to avoid appearing weak after decades of futile preparation, Rome would gather all the men it could find among the Latins, abandoning all lands and jobs not useful to the war effort, to gather the maximum number of men it could to fight once final time against Carthage. But Carthage would not destroy the city of Rome as the Romans would have done to them in our timeline, and in this reality it is possible that the end of Rome would come through the rest of the Italic peoples, especially the Etruscans, having to endure the constant bloodlust and wars desires of the Romans. The Etruscans, combined with other Italic city-states previously under Roman control, would form a brief coalition to stop the Romans and Latins once and for all. Needless to say, that last war would be the most brutal and bloody the Romans had ever experienced, with the Carthaginians barely intervening in the conflict, leaving the Etruscans to do all the work. And finally, after years of brutal Roman resistance, the city founded by Romulus would fall, completely razed to the ground, its population massacred, their women and children enslaved, with the Etruscans regaining control of what was previously Rome, something that had not happened since the time of the kings of Rome. And with that, Rome would be no more, and Carthage would thrive during the rest of antiquity as the greatest power of the Western Mediterranean. So, Rome is no more. Now what? Now that Carthage's survival has been prolonged indefinitely, could that merchant empire replace what Rome would become in our timeline? No. Carthage was not an expansionist military-focused power. They were merchants, businessmen, and explorers. Sure, over the centuries their borders would change, expanding into certain parts of the Mediterranean and perhaps beyond, creating new strategic colonies for trade. But they would never replace that great power that would unify the entire ancient world as Rome did in our reality. It simply wasn't in their blood to run their empire that way. In a way, a classical world dominated by Carthage is one that advances less, is more disconnected, and takes longer to develop and civilize its population. The direct or indirect presence and influence of Carthage throughout the Western Mediterranean would create a status quo of permanent stagnation, where things would change only very, very slowly. For example, I can visualize the Gauls eventually becoming civilized enough to create multiple small unified kingdoms, thanks to the constant cultural and commercial influence of Carthage, but it would be a long and tedious process that would take several centuries longer than in our reality to occur. But thanks to the survival of the Celtic culture in Europe, perhaps by the time the Germanic immigrations would eventually occur due to climatic changes proper of the centuries in which those Germanic incursions occurred in our timeline, the Gauls could by then have unified into a powerful and relatively advanced kingdom, which, allied with an aging Carthage, could have the necessary resources to repel the Germanic invasions. Although I cannot say whether the Gauls would be able to survive the terrifying invasion of the Huns in Europe, with these nomads coming from Asia perhaps having a chance of establishing themselves permanently in the north, or even in Central Europe if they are able to repel the Gauls and the rest of the Celtic and Germanic coalitions. Or perhaps that situation would not necessarily occur. perhaps the Huns would decide to target their invasions towards the part of the classical world that was the most advanced and richest, the eastern part. Because yes, while Carthage would spend the following centuries influencing and trading with its barbarian neighbors to the west, in the east the Hellenistic influence would continue to thrive and remain an unshakable legacy, but without a Roman flavor in their culture, so to speak. Here, the different Greek kingdoms would only have Alexander the Great as a point of reference, as the ultimate inspiration to which to aspire, not Rome. During all that long time, the Greeks, as usual, would have been divided and fought among themselves, with the added challenge of having to fight to maintain their Hellenic influence in the Persian territories, with multiple factions throughout the centuries, such as the Parthians or the Sassanids, trying to expel the Hellenic presence in those Persian lands. Eventually, I think that rather than one culture supplanting the other, it would have been more likely that over the centuries, Greek and Persian cultures would have merged to create a completely original hybrid culture, probably with a language derived from Greek and Persian, with one or more religions derived from Zoroastrianism and Hellenism, with perhaps some Jewish or Christian influence if Christianity still exists in this timeline. I find it difficult to assume that the descendants of the Diadochi of Alexander the Great would ever be fully reunited, but perhaps several of their most important territories would be reunited with each other through centuries of wars and attempts at reconquest by charismatic and capable generals, using the legitimacy of having inherited Alexander the Great's will to legitimize their campaigns. If this is the case, then the Greeks may have a chance to resist any Hunnic invasions by repelling them and redirecting them towards Western Europe, perhaps even angering the hypothetical kingdom of the Gauls and the Carthaginian Empire in the process, which could at some point lead to a confrontation that could even escalate into a major war of influence around the Mediterranean. But predicting what would happen later in the story is now almost impossible to achieve. Can the Greek presence survive in the Persian culture permanently? Would Islam even exist in this reality without the widespread expansion of Christianity throughout much of the classical world? Will the Carthaginians survive forever despite their cultural stagnation and rigidity? What would that world hypothetically look like during the Mongol invasion centuries later? These are many questions that we may never have answers to, but what I am sure of is that the year 2025 in that world would look and sound completely alien to us, something completely impossible to imagine without a hint of Roman influence in that reality. And with that, I think this is a good moment to end this video. I hope you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and comment on what you thought of it. And without anything else to say, see you next time.